Did you know that Europe only achieved peace after the Napoleonic Wars, thanks to a meeting straight out of Game of Thrones, filled with secret alliances, inflated egos, and backstage deals? We're about to uncover how the Congress of Vienna rebuilt Europe in 1814, not with idealistic treaties or inspiring speeches, but with political bargains, silent maneuvers, and favors exchanged behind closed doors. Stick with me until the end, because we're gonna see how one French diplomat, seen as a traitor by some and a genius by others, became the real MVP of this event, and maybe even responsible for nearly a century of European peace. But first, let's set the scene. Imagine a continent devastated by almost 25 uninterrupted years of war. Napoleon, yeah, that short guy who basically played Civilization 6 in real life and nearly conquered everything, had finally been defeated. Now, with him out of the picture, the major victors decided to sit down and shape Europe's future. But unlike that boring history class you slept through, this Congress wasn't exactly a shining example of diplomatic transparency or harmony. To be honest, it felt more like a shareholders' meeting from Succession, just with diplomats dressed like characters from Bridgerton. Behind all the official speeches about eternal peace, unity, and friendship, the most critical decisions were made privately, in whispered side meetings, behind fake smiles and pats on the back. Exactly like that family gathering you attend just to keep up appearances, while everyone's secretly arguing on WhatsApp. And that's precisely where the real history unfolded, in these backroom deals. These diplomats were politicians, strategists, and actors worthy of an Oscar for best diplomatic performance. But the most unlikely star of this meeting was a Frenchman who achieved the impossible, defeated, discredited, and literally representing the country that nearly destroyed the continent. He emerged from the Congress as its greatest winner. Curious how he pulled it off? Stick around, because our next historical protagonist is none other than Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the French Littlefinger. Picture this: your entire nation just got steamrolled. Your emperor has been exiled to a tiny island in the Mediterranean, and your country's credibility is somewhere between bankrupt startup and cancelled influencer. Welcome to France, 1814. This was the scenario facing Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, a diplomat who had more political lives than Littlefinger from Game of Thrones or Tom Wambsgans from Succession. Seriously, this guy switched sides more often than your coworker who agrees with whoever's currently leading the meeting. Talleyrand began his career serving a king, jumped ship to support a revolution, then backed Napoleon, and finally landed safely advocating for the monarchy again. If politics had a survival mode like Hearts of Iron 4, Talleyrand was playing on legendary difficulty. And yet, despite being the diplomat from the losing side at the Congress of Vienna, he walked in quietly through the back door and somehow ended up calling half the shots. But how did this political chameleon turn France's massive defeat into an unexpected victory? Well, Talleyrand knew diplomacy better than anyone else in the room. He saw immediately that the alliance against Napoleon wasn't a monolith. It was a fragile collection of ambitious, distrustful monarchies all itching to secure their own piece of Europe's shattered puzzle. While the big dogs, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, were busy fighting over who got the juiciest territories, Talleyrand seized the moment. With strategic whispers and quiet nods, he played them all against each other, pointing out subtly that weakening France too much would just hand absolute power to one of the other players, tipping the delicate balance. This wasn't grandstanding. It was pure diplomatic judo. Talleyrand managed to insert France into the core decision-making group, creating an entirely new power dynamic where he became indispensable. Like Tom Wambsgans slipping quietly from punchline to CEO, Talleyrand turned humiliation into a seat at the winner's table, without ever appearing like he was actually trying to dominate the conversation. And how exactly did he achieve this masterstroke? By reading the cracks in the system. And believe me, cracks were something this Congress had plenty of. Ever played a multiplayer match of Overwatch? If yes, you know exactly what balance of power means. Nobody can be too strong, or the whole match breaks apart. This was pretty much the idea behind the Congress of Vienna's master plan. After Napoleon basically became that player whose snowballs in Civilization 6, conquering territories faster than your cousin grabs pizza slices at a family party, the European powers decided they never wanted to see another Napoleon again. The solution? Keep everyone roughly equal, so no single nation could dominate again. Sounds reasonable, right? Well, in practice, it was a diplomatic headache worse than coordinating plans in your work WhatsApp group. Europe's leaders knew that too much power concentrated in one place was asking for trouble. So, instead of completely crushing France or overly rewarding Russia, Britain, Austria, Prussia, and France itself built a delicate system of checks and balances. If anyone got too ambitious, the others would team up and gently, or not so gently, push them back into line. It was the ultimate diplomatic crab bucket. Whenever one crab tries climbing out, the others pull it right back down. Think about it like office politics. That talented new hire looks like they're about to snag a promotion. Suddenly, the rest of the team miraculously becomes best friends, agreeing on one thing only: making sure that person stays exactly where they are. Nobody could become powerful enough to dominate. This careful strategy meant the European powers were constantly suspicious of each other, watching every move like players scanning each other's tech tree in a cutthroat Civilization VI multiplayer session. At the Congress, Britain worried about Russia getting too strong, Austria was paranoid about Prussia's ambitions in Germany. Prussia eyed Austria's dominance suspiciously, and France, guided expertly by Talleyrand, made sure none of them felt entirely comfortable. They even allowed France to maintain significant influence precisely to counterbalance the others. It was tense, uncertain, but surprisingly effective. The downside? Well, this delicate equilibrium required trust. And trust, as we know, isn't exactly the strong suit of powerful empires. Each nation smiled politely but kept daggers ready behind their backs, fully prepared for betrayal. Because, as history, and every season of Game of Thrones, has taught us, alliances are made to be broken. And this mistrust meant that beneath the polite diplomatic chatter, the real action was happening behind closed doors, far away from public view. The official meetings were mostly theater. The real power games were happening backstage, orchestrated by diplomats whose greatest skill was appearing not to wield any power at all. Officially, the Congress of Vienna was a dignified diplomatic event. Unofficially? It was basically a season finale of House of Cards, a non-stop flurry of secret meetings, whispered negotiations, and strategic manipulation. Imagine all the diplomacy from the diplomat combined with the cunning political maneuvers of the West Wing, just set in glamorous ballrooms packed with powdered wigs and velvet suits. The most important discussions rarely happened in the grand halls with official translators scribbling furiously. Instead, real power was brokered quietly, after midnight, over brandy and cigars, or whispered in corridors during dance breaks. Austrian Chancellor Metternich and British Foreign Secretary Castlereagh skillfully played Russian Tsar Alexander I, who was convinced he was Europe's liberator but easily distracted by flattery. Think of it like your boss believing they're running the show while actually being gently guided by their assistants into doing precisely what everyone else wants. But the biggest coup of all was orchestrated, once again, by our friend Talleyrand. Remember how he convinced everyone that sidelining France entirely would upset the balance? He wasn't just bluffing. He actually managed to make France indispensable, quietly slipping into the inner circle despite France's crushing military defeat. This subtle play was akin to that coworker who somehow ends up in every important meeting despite never being officially invited. And here's the fun part. The Congress wasn't just attended by great powers. Representatives from places that barely existed anymore also showed up, adding an absurdist comedy vibe to the event. Imagine turning up to a high-stakes meeting pretending you still run a country that literally just disappeared. Kind of like showing up to the family WhatsApp after leaving the group months ago, casually chiming in as if nothing happened. These smaller nations were trying desperately to hold on to whatever scraps of influence they could salvage, making private deals, trading favors, and hustling harder than freelancers chasing invoices at the end of the month. And while the big dogs plotted Europe's future, the smaller states were trying their best to squeeze something, anything, from the diplomatic buffet. But if these clandestine games taught us anything, it's that beneath the grand speeches and silk-covered tables, Europe was rebuilt by people who could control power without seeming to wield it openly. It was a high-stakes game played entirely in the shadows. And speaking of shadows, while the big players moved their pawns, smaller powers quietly scrambled just to survive. They didn't dream of dominance. Their ambitions were simpler: make sure they weren't swallowed up entirely by the giants around them. Hey, Discovers, real quick before we dive back in, I've got a small favor to ask. If you're the kind of person who loves a good story, the real ones, with epic battles, wild mysteries, unforgettable characters, and lessons that still echo today, then this channel is for you. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore history in a way that's curious, smart, and surprisingly fun. Because understanding the past has never been this interesting. So far, we've talked about giants, the nations who called the shots. But what about the little guys, the smaller kingdoms and states that found themselves at Europe's greatest diplomatic feast? Well, for these smaller powers, the Congress of Vienna felt less like a triumphant victory banquet and more like that awkward family dinner from Don't Look Up, everyone politely pretending things were fine while quietly panicking about their own survival. Picture this: the major players are fighting over who gets the mansion, the yacht, and the vacation home. Meanwhile, the smaller relatives, countries like Portugal, Spain, the various German and Italian states, and even Sweden, were just hoping no one noticed them pocketing the silverware. For these nations, the stakes weren't domination, but simple existence. Some hoped to keep their colonies, others to protect their borders, and many just prayed to stay relevant enough not to be casually erased from the map. Portugal and Spain, two once powerful empires, found themselves politely begging to keep their colonial holdings in Latin America, like your uncle desperately trying to hold on to the antique car collection when the rest of the family is dividing up property. Italian and German states, meanwhile, scrambled to secure the best possible positions in a rapidly reshaping Europe, trying to avoid becoming insignificant pawns in the bigger players' games. It was a diplomatic free-for-all, like siblings fighting over who gets grandma's vintage TV after the wealthier relatives took everything else valuable. Sweden cleverly negotiated its way into a stronger position by swapping Finland, which it had already lost to Russia, for Norway, treating countries like cards in a particularly ruthless game of Monopoly. Smaller German states played off rivalries between Prussia and Austria, hoping to gain minor territorial advantages or at least some political protection. Everyone at the Congress had their own hidden agenda, quietly maneuvering behind smiles, carefully scripted toasts, and excessively formal dinners. Yet beneath all the elegant facades and fake smiles, anxiety ran deep. These countries knew well that they existed at the mercy of bigger powers who could reshuffle borders overnight. It was high-stakes diplomacy disguised as pleasant socializing, a desperate scramble where any misstep could mean extinction. But if smaller nations fought just to keep a seat at Europe's table, the big powers had an even darker agenda. Peace wasn't just about balance. It required control. And control, as it turned out, meant crushing any spark of freedom before it could ignite into revolution. Because as history has proven, powerful empires don't just fear rival nations, they fear their own people. So far, we've painted the Congress of Vienna as a carefully choreographed diplomatic dance, like a royal ball straight out of Bridgerton, only with a lot more backstabbing. But here's the thing about balls. Beneath all the glitter, gowns, and glamour often lies something far less attractive. In this case, a peace built on fear, censorship, and repression. Think less romantic waltz, more dystopian control straight out of The Handmaid's Tale, or Equilibrium. See, the leaders at Vienna weren't just worried about rival empires. Their biggest nightmare was the revolutionary spirit unleashed by decades of turmoil. After all, once people got a taste of freedom, equality, and nationalism, they weren't keen to quietly return to the old ways of absolute monarchies and rigid hierarchies. To Europe's crowned heads, the word liberty was about as welcome as a critical post in the family WhatsApp group. To squash these dangerous ideas before they spread, the great powers quietly established something called the Concert of Europe, basically a secret diplomatic club designed to crush rebellions before they could even start. It was a kind of early 19th century surveillance state, the original version of Orwell's Big Brother or the sinister counsels from The Boys, ensuring everyone stayed quietly in line, whether they liked it or not. This shadowy alliance was brutally effective. Whenever nationalist or liberal movements popped up, they were swiftly crushed by cooperative intervention. Austria, Russia, and Prussia were particularly enthusiastic about stamping out freedom wherever it appeared, like moderators aggressively shutting down unruly comments on social media. Britain mostly stayed out, but even they didn't object openly. Stability was the priority, no matter the cost. Ironically, the Congress, which started with lofty ideals about peace, ended up building a Europe where peace meant order, and order meant silencing anyone who questioned the status quo. Journalists were censored, revolutionary thinkers were imprisoned or exiled, and nationalist movements were brutally suppressed. Freedom of speech became the equivalent of raising your voice during the company meeting, allowed only if you agreed completely with the bosses. Of course, keeping everyone quietly in line required constant vigilance. Behind the polite smiles at diplomatic receptions was a ruthless determination to maintain power. The leaders knew well that beneath the enforced calm, tension simmered, waiting for a chance to explode. And nowhere was that tension clearer than in Austria, the empire desperately struggling to keep its diverse, fragmented population from boiling over into outright chaos. After all, it's hard enough keeping peace among your rivals. It's even harder when your worst enemy might be inside your own borders. Imagine running a family business with 14 siblings who barely speak to each other, all locked in a constant fight over who deserves more shares, attention, or respect. That was pretty much the daily reality of the Austrian Empire after the Congress of Vienna. With 14 ethnic groups and 17 different languages, Austria wasn't exactly the poster child for national unity. It was more like a tense boardroom straight out of Succession, where alliances changed hourly, and trust was always in short supply. Keeping this empire together wasn't just diplomacy, it was daily crisis management. Chancellor Metternich, Austria's political mastermind, knew very well that holding his sprawling domain intact was like spinning plates while walking a tightrope. Drop one plate, and the entire act would fall apart. Internally, Austria was constantly balancing the demands of Hungarians, Czechs, Poles, Italians, Croats, and a dozen others, each group demanding recognition, autonomy, or at least a better seat at the imperial table. Take Hungary, for example. It was the largest and loudest voice in Austria's multiethnic chorus, practically functioning as an independent state within the empire. The Hungarians had their own government, their own taxes, usually lighter, and their own army obligations, usually fewer. It was like having a sibling who barely contributes to family expenses but expects the nicest room and the comfiest chair at every family gathering. And Austria's rulers knew they couldn't afford to alienate Hungary, or anyone else, completely. Every ethnic group required careful handling. Too much pressure, and rebellions could flare up; too little, and other groups would complain bitterly. It was an exhausting balancing act, like managing a fragile team project at work, where pleasing one colleague inevitably means upsetting another. Externally, Austria was powerful, influential, and respected, one of the key architects of Europe's new order. But internally? It was a precarious puzzle, held together by cautious diplomacy, careful concessions, and constant vigilance. Metternich and his successors tried everything from repression to concessions, censorship to strategic bribery, just to maintain this shaky unity. Ironically, Austria's internal fragility forced it into a diplomatic role as Europe's peacemaker. War wasn't an option; war would expose their internal divisions. Peace, even oppressive peace, was crucial to their survival. Austria didn't maintain peace because they loved tranquility. They did it because the slightest external shock could shatter their fragile internal harmony. Yet, despite this endless juggling, the peace crafted in Vienna managed to hold. But as you might guess, such delicate balancing couldn't last forever. Because beneath the surface of enforced calm, cracks were spreading, slowly undermining the careful diplomatic work of 1814. And as those cracks grew deeper, the continent found itself headed inevitably towards a dramatic reckoning. Because peace built on compromise, repression, and backroom deals is always temporary, a brief intermission in Europe's ongoing drama of power. So, after pulling back the velvet curtains of Europe's most sophisticated political drama, what exactly did the Congress of Vienna achieve? On the surface, it delivered a century of unprecedented peace, no small feat after decades of near-constant war. But beneath those grand ballrooms, elegant dances, and beautifully scripted toasts lay a reality far less glamorous, a peace constructed through manipulation, repression, and the careful silencing of revolutionary ideas. At the heart of it all was our star diplomat, Talleyrand, who proved that true power isn't always about wearing a crown. Like Michael Corleone in The Godfather, he understood clearly, the most significant decisions aren't made on the battlefield. They're quietly settled over dinner tables, hidden behind polite smiles and coded conversations. Yet, despite all this masterful diplomacy, the Vienna settlement was built on shaky ground. It relied heavily on repression and mistrust, like family members forced to play nice at a gathering, secretly waiting for the right moment to restart their arguments. The smaller nations left the Congress feeling cautiously relieved but perpetually insecure, knowing their fate depended entirely on the goodwill, or lack thereof, of the bigger players. For the major powers, the balance of power was both a strength and an inherent weakness. By ensuring everyone remained equally frustrated, the Congress kept Europe stable, for a while. But beneath this enforced calm, resentment, nationalism, and revolutionary ideas simmered quietly, waiting to explode. And explode they eventually did, but that's a story for our next video. Because while Vienna succeeded temporarily, the unresolved tensions, secret resentments, and suppressed ideals planted seeds for future turmoil. Next time, we'll dive deeper into how the cracks formed in Vienna's careful compromises turned into fractures, reshaping the continent yet again and pushing Europe toward an inevitable conflict. After all, if history teaches us anything, it's that no peace built on hidden deals and unresolved grudges can last forever.